The value of gold in Oldskool Runescape is going down the toilet, whilst the selection of items keep going up and up in price, and this is all since the G tax was introduced. I'll be looking into this to see if this could all be caused by Jagex using the G tax to raise the price of bonds in an attempt to price out botters. But if they are doing this, it could be the death of Oldskool Runescape. So what is happening with the economy? If you follow it like me, you'll have probably noticed something strange going on with it this year, and this has really peaked in the last few months. To understand why this appears to be linked to the G tax and price of bonds, we need to look into what's actually happening. Take the Turmerican Shadow for example. It's now a higher price than it has been for almost a year, and that was just after the Tombstone Mascot was released. Now you may be thinking, well that's just down to the G tax, but according to Modass they're no longer even removing T-bows from the game and only remove an average of 1 shadow per day. Yet it's the most farmed content in the entire game, the best moneymaker, the raid most players do, where you can get uniques far faster than you ever could at Chambers of Xeric, and the shadow isn't going down in price. It just doesn't make any sense. It's not a one-off either. It seems that the best items in every raid are doing the same thing. The Twisted Bow has been going up pretty much ever since the GE tax was introduced. It's up from 900 million to 1.5 billion, and the scythe has gone up 60% in the last year. Again, it would be very easy to associate this with the GE tax removing items from within the game, but if we have a look at other items used within the GE tax, we see very different results. This is the Fortified Missouri set, which has been falling in price by quite a lot. It's less than half the price it was a year ago, which gets even worse when it comes to what's happening with the price of GP. The Toxic Blowpipe being only worth 2 million GP, you would think that the G tax would have a huge impact on it, since you could in theory remove a whole week's worth of trades with just 32 billion GP, which is small change compared to what the G tax collects. Yet it's gone down in price for the last year. Then we have the Trident of the Seas, which is only 40 to 50,000 GP, and every week the trade value is a mere 180 million GP for all of them, yet the price still remains around the ALG price, and you get the point. What I've noticed is that the G tax only seems to have an impact if the item is a very rare reward like the Sang Staff shown here, or items like Bandos and Armor, which have their own item sync as well, since we use Armor to create Missouri and Bandos to create Torva. So how much do we actually collect from the GE tax? Well, I couldn't do it for every item, but this is just from 20 items that have a very high volume, price, or combination of the two. The first 11 on the list bring in some of the highest tax in the game, and the last 9 are various consumables that I just put in there because they're just interesting to see how much tax they generate. In total, those 20 items bring in 17.58 billion tax daily, and there are over 3,800 tradable items, although most of the tax does come from the highest priced items. So looking at different data given out by Jagex and a few other players that have done some calculations, the amount of GE tax collected daily seems to be estimated as between 60 and 100 billion GP. If we go straight down the middle and estimate it at 80 billion, even then most of that is used as a way to remove excess GP from the game and only a small amount to actually remove excess items. This will hopefully now all start to make sense as to why something is seriously amiss in our economy. Even if we're generous and say half of that GP is used to remove items, and the wording suggests that it's probably a lot less, 40 billion isn't going to make a dent in the price of the shadows, T-bows or scythes at the current prices. With all of these other items also being removed, you'd be lucky if you could afford to take maybe 2 of each of those weapons out daily. So what could possibly be driving the price of those items? Well, it's actually the collapse of the value of GP, which only started after the G tax was introduced, even though the whole purpose of the tax is to do the complete opposite. If you're wondering what I mean by this, the Oldskool Runescape economy is like any economy. If you introduce more GP into it, the price of everything goes up, and if you remove GP from it, the price of everything on average goes down. There's also some indicators that show you when this is happening, like the price of bonds, because unlike items that lose demand over time as we get more and more of them, 14 days membership never changes and every player consistently needs the same amount of membership, so the supply and demand remains fairly equal. There will always be highs and lows as new content is released, but you can see consistently between 2017 and 2021 that bonds went up by about 20% per year. This indicates that 20% more GP is being brought into the game every year. However, as soon as the GE tax was introduced, the price of bonds started to increase in price a lot more rapidly. In fact, it has doubled to around 40%, and don't forget that the GE tax removing gold from the game, again, should be doing the opposite and bringing it down from 20% rather than doubling it to 40%. You can also see this happening with the price of gold outside of Oldskool Runescape. From what I found, the price of GP on the black market was $0.3 per million for quite a long time, but this dropped rapidly this year and is now $0.19 per million, a 36% decrease in 10 months, backing up what the bond price suggests. What all of this is telling us is that if we ignore supply and demand for now, there is 40% more gold to go around than there was 12 months ago. So on average, every item should be worth 40% more than it was this time last year. The reason the rarest items are going up in price is because not that many new ones come into the game, so they're reflecting most of that 40% in the price that they are now. That also applies to items like bandos and armor that have their own item sink, meaning they're not being flooded with new ones, driving the price down. However, other items like Missouri and the Fang, which are common from the Tombs of a Massacre, have gone down in price despite that huge inflation, just because we farm far more than people actually want to buy. It even shows on items in the middle, like Dragon Claws, which is rarer than some items in Chambers of Xeric, but not the rarest, in which case it hasn't received the full benefit of inflation, but it has gone up slightly. You can check this with almost every item, whether it's on the GE tax list or not. The driving factor is the huge amount of gold coming into the game, raising many prices rather than the actual GE tax itself. But the biggest question is, where the hell is double the amount of gold coming from into the economy since the GE tax was introduced? What's important to note is that getting a Turmican Shadow drop does not bring 1.4 billion GP into the economy because it was already there. You are given the 1.4 billion by another player, so the GP just changes hand. It isn't new GP. The way GP is brought in is through drops that can be alch for GP, GP drops themselves, bars that can be smithed and then alched, thieving, and the ancient statuettes from Revenants since they're exchanged for GP, as well as a few other smaller things. On the flip side, removing GP from the game is construction, as we pay GP for supplies and to create planks, some death mechanics, shops, and some content that require GP to access or use them. So for inflation to go up to 40% instead of 20%, we would need to have double the amount of GP creating content there is since 2021, plus at least another 40 billion GP on top of that per day that the GE tax is meant to be removing. To put that into context, the entirety of smithing only creates just over 20 billion GP a day. So what content that generates or removes GP have been introduced since the GE tax came out? The Wilderness boss rework doesn't have many alchable drops, but does drop a decent amount of GP, which brings about 2 billion into the game a day. Next doesn't have anything of note, and neither does the Tombs of a Massacre or the Guardians of the Rift. The Phantom Musper does have a few alchables on its drop table, but not enough to even bring in 1 billion a day. The only thing of real note seems to be the Desert Treasure 2 bosses, which as an estimate I suspect bring in about 4 billion a day. Overall, that's 7 billion GP per day coming in, and the GE tax alone is 40 billion GP going out, before I even include things like Bounty Hunter, the additional construction items like the gold sink that were added, and now the Scar Essence mine as well, removing even more GP from the game. The last thing we need to factor in is the removal of the Duel Arena back in July 2022, which used to remove 21 billion GP per day according to Jagex in 2018, and with inflation that may have been as high as 30 billion in 2022. But if we add all of these things together, being very conservative in the numbers, the net effect should be that inflation is shrinking from 20% by about 5 billion GP per day. Now, I don't have all the information, unfortunately, for how much that should be in terms of percentage, but you would expect it to be fairly significant. Bonds should be at a bare minimum going up in price much slower, and gold on the black market should be worth what it used to be, if not a little bit more. Absolutely everything suggests that there's an external factor pumping ridiculous amounts of GP into our game. And there's only really 3 possibilities that this could be, as far as I can see. The first is a massive bot problem, which we definitely have, and it's probably as bad as it's ever been. But to produce this kind of result, there would have to be enough bots to create twice as many GP drops and alchables as both the entire player base and bots did before the GE tax was introduced. It would probably require 5 to 10 times as many bots as there used to be, and it's bad, but it's not that bad. The second one would be if someone figured out how to duplicate GP. But given how obvious this is and how many times Jagex have found people bug abusing all the way back to P-Hats back in the day, doing the same thing, for them not to find it or even be aware of it after 18 months, I just don't think that's a genuine possibility. It all points to one thing. The GE tax was introduced, and as a result, tons of item prices started to behave very strangely. We presumed, naturally, that it was people manipulating the GE or investing in the items in the item sink. But 40% inflation in 12 months isn't manipulation, it's an influx of GP into the game. If I was running Jagex, I would be very tempted to use the GE tax to increase the price of bonds, for this reason. They always mention the anti-cheat team, which will be costing them a lot of money each year trying to get rid of bots. But if you increase the price of bonds, you reduce the money that bots make. If you can buy a bond and sell it on the GE for 10 million instead of the 5 million it used to be, why would you go to a dodgy site where you might get scammed and your account banned when you can do it through Jagex safely without the risk of a ban? It forces botters to reduce the price they sell for and also their income. This will force some botters to move on because they're not making enough. Jagex makes more money from bonds, and if the price of bonds go up enough, it wouldn't be worth any botters doing in the future when 1 million GP is worth 1 cent or 1 penny per million. It may surprise you to hear this, but I wouldn't be against them doing that if it wasn't for one thing, which is greed. As far as I'm concerned, if someone is going to buy gold, they're going to do it regardless. Whether that be from a third party or via bonds, and if you have a market where people can make money selling something, there will always be sellers, so why not make it Jagex? Well, here's the problem with that idea. If the GE tax was being used, that GP will be getting pumped back into the economy instead of removing it. All of a sudden, after the Duel Arena finished, if we had nothing to remove the 30 billion GP that it used to do, it would make a lot of sense as to why the value of GP is crashing so hard. The next logical step would be to try and remove GP in other ways, like banning people with huge banks. A few days ago, BTC was banned with 1 trillion GP, and the whole Stellar Mod Trident saga was part of a bigger picture to remove some of the wealthiest real-world traders in the game. Is Jagex doing this? Well, I obviously don't really know, but something huge is affecting the economy and nothing seems to make any sense anymore. It all started around the same time GE tax was introduced, and everything strange that has been happening with the economy would suddenly make a lot of sense if they were. I also remember Matt Kay, who used to work at Jagex, saying botters probably make 10 times more than Jagex do, so why not try to take a bit of that profit? Well, the reason they shouldn't or can't is that it doesn't just devalue the GP bots have, but every single account in the game, including yours. If you think I'm blowing this all out of proportion and it's not that big of a problem, the sole reason people buy bonds and put them on the GE is to sell them for gold. Exactly 12 months ago, the value of bonds sold in 1 week was 461 billion GP, and in the last week it was 900 billion GP, which is 128 billion GP every single day.